Hi, everybody. This is Lee Howard from Diana T. Myers and Associates. Thanks for joining us today. We have on the call, we have myself, we have Lauren Whitley from the Eastern PACOC and Sierra Carnes from the Western PACOC, as well as Brendan Almond from DCED. And hopefully between the four of us, we can answer all your questions that we all hope that you have today for us. Next slide, please. We're going to go over just some sort of forward-looking information. I know that folks are still very much working through issues, and even though about a third of the counties are looking forward to reopening at the end of this week, that does not impact everybody, and I know that there is certainly a crisis still at hand for many counties. So even with that in place, we're going to have a forward-looking conversation, but certainly not meant to sort of negate or discount the crisis mode that many of you are still working under. That being said, considering some of the things about to happen, I think right now is certainly the time to begin to talk about next steps and future planning, and really trying to walk and chew gum here at the same time with managing the current needs, as well as looking forward to what we can expect. So today we're going to talk about Governor Wolf's reopening plan. Not really to get into any sort of detail around it at all, just to talk about some of the dates related to that. Also, and really how it plays into the next part of the agenda, which is a discussion around eviction, and then thirdly, planning for what comes next. Not listed here on the agenda, but hopefully also hearing from you all about questions and needs and things like that. Next slide, please. Okay. Some of the information there at the top is not visible for whatever reason. I'm not sure what that reason is, but let me just make sure that I have this pulled up on my computer as well. Oh, there we go. Thank you for whatever you just did, Brendan. Beginning May 8th, a number of counties, I think 24 in total, been talking about within your organization what that means in terms of reopening, and how that will impact your operations and changes happening within your organization, if any. I know some folks have not closed down at all or have not moved staff to a work from home status. So in that case, it may not make any difference. The big thing to know is that if you're in one of these counties, you may be very close. I know that there was a lot of talk about, for the most part, none of the Southwest PA counties are included in that. And apparently a handful of them are very close to meeting that yellow status. And so these are sort of some thoughts to consider as you're planning or as you anticipate moving into that yellow status. I haven't had a chance to check today, but apparently at some point today, the administration will be releasing guidelines for businesses to reopen and things like that. So again, if you are in one of these counties, I would certainly encourage you to seek out that information. My guess is that it's on the governor's website, but I'm not sure. If not, hopefully it would be posted on the Department of Health and PEMA's website and others. The reason I'm bringing all this up is to say that to some degree in these counties, and I'm certain others in the near future, things will be back to business, probably not business as normal, because I know that some of the business reopening will still require social distancing and other precautions. but nonetheless, things will be operational again, and I would expect in those cases for folks to be coming into your offices to request assistance, most likely to be seeking out employment opportunities if they have permanently lost their job as opposed to being furloughed, and things like that. So just wanted to sort of raise that and get that sort of timeline on folks' radar in the off chance that it's not already there and this hasn't been something that you've been thinking about. Next slide, please. I don't have a great internet connection, so I can't tell if this looks goofy on my screen or everybody's. In the event that it's just mine, I'm going to keep moving ahead. So the other thing that I wanted to raise, again, this is all sort of building towards our eviction-focused conversation. But the other important thing to raise is that the PA Supreme Court issued new guidance last week on April 28th. Through this new guidance, the status of their emergency order has been expanded, and at this point, what I've pasted here into this slide is the exact language from the emergency order. But basically, what it says is that the eviction moratorium is extended until May 11th. At that time, communities may resume evictions. And I think this is something that's incredibly important to be considered, and that all of your organizations are sort of planning for, and hopefully that your community as a whole is really coming together and identifying resources that can be plugged in and how folks are going to be directed, etc., for assistance. Next slide, please. So while the statewide eviction moratorium ends on the 11th, the order from the PA Supreme Court gives individual counties the power to extend the eviction moratorium longer through the end of May. I know that some folks have been collecting this information. I don't have a county-by-county breakdown of the dates. I know I've heard at least a couple counties say yes, their county has extended through May 31st. I've heard a few people say May 14th. So I think if you're not aware of what the plan is in your county for extending the eviction moratorium, you could certainly call up and find out from your county judicial system if that's something that you just can't seem to find information about. I would guess that it means that your county is going to follow the May 11th eviction moratorium. If you have a relationship with a fair housing organization or legal aid in your county, or that covers your county, you could certainly also reach out to them to confirm if that is in fact the correct timeline. So even with this information, there was also a letter that was issued by the State Attorney General's office, as well as the PA Apartment Association. The CEO there and the Attorney General have sort of co-signed a letter asking landlords to delay evictions until July 15th. That request has no sort of legal standing. It really is just making a case and making an argument, asking landlords to delay for lack of payment. If there are issues related to the lease, such as property damage or disturbing the peace in the building or the community or things like that, that falls under a different sort of bucket of issues. But if the main issue is a lack of payment of rent, they're asking for landlords to hold off and give time for folks to either restart employment, regain employment, obtain community resources to help them catch up on their rent, or to establish some type of payment plan with the landlord. The letter goes on to also request that landlords extend their grace periods, waive late fees, and in cases where the landlord can, even in some cases waive the rent if they believe, that tenant has the potential for being a good long-term tenant. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that potentially could occur in a community. But one of the most important things, and I hope that folks already have sort of a process for this, and if not, we can certainly gear one of the next office hours talks to having somebody present on this, is information about creating a written payment plan for residents based on the situation at hand. So if that's something that you think would be helpful in your community, feel free to let us know either by submitting a comment in the chat box, or you can indicate more specifically what would be helpful in that regard to our online survey that you can fill out anytime with your questions. The link to that's at the end of the presentation, so we'll get to that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Oh, and the link there for accessing that letter, if you think some of that information would be helpful, the link is on the last slide there. Information, so I mentioned something about landlords potentially even forgiving rent. So how would they be able to do that? Obviously, if a landlord has a mortgage on a building, obviously taxes, insurance, etc., how would the landlord be able to just sort of blanketly forgive or reduce the rent for the months impacted? So that may not be even a reasonable starting point. I just want to warn folks, with a landlord, I wouldn't sort of start the conversation with this. But regardless, nearly every bank is now offering mortgage forbearance or deferral options. So assuming that the landlord does have, debt and a mortgage on the building that he or she is renting out to your client, they can apply to defer their mortgage. In some cases, it's being handled in a number of different ways, but in some cases, the mortgage payment can be stopped for 3 months. In some cases, it can be reduced to perhaps, if you pay everything through your mortgage, including your insurance and your taxes and all that, perhaps the mortgage portion can be reduced. In some cases, I've heard that mortgage companies are simply taking those 3 months if somebody qualifies and adding that to the back end. So if you have a 30-year mortgage, it's basically creating a 30-year and 3-month mortgage by delaying and postponing those payments till the end of the repayment period. You can talk to landlords, obviously, about the fact that rental assistance for arrears is going to be made available. Obviously, I wouldn't promise anybody anything because you may not know whether or not your community is going to receive funding to support that activity if you don't already have funding, and you don't know if your client will be eligible or prioritized for that. But certainly, you could talk to your the landlord about again, delaying eviction to determine what, if any, resources, community resources the household is eligible for. I just want to remind folks, if you're on the call and you're not talking, please just hit mute so we don't hear background noise. That'll allow everybody to hear more easily. If you don't have mute on your phone, you can hit *6 to mute and to unmute. Thank you. Look at encouraging, creative solutions. I made up this convoluted example here, but there's any number of examples I'm sure that could be created. But this is based on the assumption that of what level of rent the renter can afford. So, for example, if the tenant is 6 months into a 12-month lease, which is $500 a month, but missed the rental payment for months, it says 5 and 5. It should say 5 and 6. Sorry. The $1,000 then in rent owed can be added to the remaining months. So rather than paying for the last 6 months of the lease, $500, this would increase the rent to $666, $67 per month. And I know that $666 may be an amount that is not comparable to what many of the clients you're working with can in fact afford. The thing that I just want to remind you all is that due to the level of unemployment that is currently being experienced across the state, I think it's within reason to assume that a number of folks who are going to be seeking out prevention assistance to make up for back rent will be people who have, in some cases, higher incomes than some of the folks that you have typically worked with. They may have been furloughed and are coming back to work and can afford that, but not that they weren't, they weren't in the money kind of thing, but they were able to pay their bills and they could afford this level of slight increase, whereas some of your more traditional clients may not have been able to afford any more money than they were already paying. So really just sort of thinking through the unique circumstances of the folks that are coming through your door in an effort to avoid eviction. Their circumstances may be a lot broader than the folks that you currently see. Additional information, in case you weren't aware, is that people who live in federally supported housing, so this would be in housing authorities and other types of federally supported housing, there are eviction preventions in place for non-payment through July 25th. So that's just something to be aware of if you have folks who are coming to you seeking assistance who live in a federally supported unit. So their needs may be, I will say, less priority because you have more time available to resolve those situations than you may have in other settings where the eviction moratorium is being lifted somewhere between May 11th and May 31st with landlords looking to begin eviction proceedings. Finally, I'll just mention on this slide, the Housing Alliance of Pennsylvania will be hosting a webinar on the 6th, so that's Wednesday at 1 o'clock. They're going to be highlighting a particular model that they're calling third-party mediation, and there's the name there of the webinar, as well as the link to register. I don't know if you have been participating, but like a lot of organizations, they've been offering ongoing webinars trying to get information out to folks that's relevant. So if this seems like, if you haven't read about the information, you can go to that website and it'll describe the webinar in more detail. And if it makes sense for you, then I would encourage you to participate and share your thoughts next week on our office hours call. Next slide, please. So there was a question that was submitted by Sarah. Does the federal support include Section 8 funded? The answer is yes, it should. If if you have questions about that, I would definitely encourage you to reach out to the Housing Authority and your community that's relevant to the Section 8. And if you need additional information or documentation showing that to give to them, I'm sure that they're aware of that. And just to reiterate, this is really due to lack of payment of rent, not to other lease violations. But if you need help in terms of finding where HUD has stated this, just let us know and we can post it somewhere or get it to you. In addition to the things I've already mentioned, one of the things that I came across this past weekend when I was looking up some information was that some communities across the state have created local coalitions or task force or social justice groups, et cetera. They've been sort of named a variety of different things, but they're calling upon landlords in the judicial system in their community to avoid eviction due to non-payment of rent. Some of these groups have sort of been, standing in front of the courthouse with signs, and some of them have just been sort of organized via Skype or Zoom or something like that, talking about sort of a policy platform that they're taking and strategies for pushing that forward, and recognition of the fact that significant numbers of people in their communities have experienced job loss, and they would like to minimize the impact of that by connecting those households as quickly as possible to new job opportunities or restoring their work, as opposed to making that whole process much more difficult, as we all know that would be without stable housing in place. If that's something that's going on in your community, that's something that you may certainly want to look into. If it's not, I don't know enough information about how successful these initiatives are turning out to be in each community. I don't know if they have been actually active long enough to be able to indicate that they have seen some success at this point, but it's certainly something that may be worth looking into. If you already have an LHOT or something like that, do you have an opportunity to reach out through your LHOT to a landlord association or to a judge that perhaps has been sympathetic in terms of working with community organizations in the past to, in some way, if not disallow, but at least discourage eviction in your community due to a non-payment of rent. Other questions to consider: does your community already have an eviction prevention program in place? Are there funding sources that you can pursue in order to build up or expand those services at this time? Does your organization or any of your community partners have relationships with, I already mentioned this, the landlord association or whatever it's called in your community? Some landlord associations are regional, so that may be another, if you're looking for who is the landlord association in my community, there's a website, I think it's called PA Landlord Association or something, and it will help connect you to the landlord associations that exist across the state. And like I said, some of those are regional. Engaging them to talk about what resources you're expecting to be awarded in your community, and talking to them about ways that assistance may be available, or folks may be able to catch up with rent in a timely way. It may make sense to bring in your Career Link or Workforce Investment Board to some of these conversations about trying to help folks regain employment as soon as possible, and whether or not there are things that your community organization can do to help facilitate or support that the processing of folks being connected to new employment opportunities. Utility companies, one of the things that can lead to eviction is if somebody has a utility cutoff. And so don't forget about that when you're thinking about reaching out to community partners. It's not just landlords. It also could be utility companies, and really talking to folks about the importance of not shutting off utilities due to non-payment of rent. Also talking to folks who are coming in to request assistance, and encouraging them to reach out and negotiate, payment plans for back payment of utilities, etc. If you don't already have relationships with legal aid or fair housing or the judicial system, really looking at either developing those relationships or enhancing those relationships, or at a minimum start conversation to talk about the expected sort of tidal wave of folks that may be coming in very, very soon to request prevention assistance. If you've already had those conversations, it would be great to hear. Would love to hear folks sort of unmute themselves and jump in to say, we've already started talking to whoever in our community, and this is what we intend to do. And if there is assistance that folks need in order to think through either who their community partners are or what these conversations may look like, would love to hear that as well, so we can sort of either do some peer idea sharing, or we can follow up with you after today's call. Anybody want to talk about work that they're already doing in anticipation of increased evictions in their community and prevention needs?
Lee, this is Sergio. Can you hear me?
Yep. Hey there.
So on top of everything else that we've been doing with hotel stays, the task force that we've been working on just put together a survey to the Landlords Association to try and get a feel of what exactly it is that they're going to be evicting, that they're holding evictions for. So we know that several landlords that work with us through our COC funding and ESG funding have potentially, anywhere from 20 to a handful of evictions that they're sitting on until the moratorium expires. And so we want to get a feel what it is that is the primary cause of the evictions that they're holding on to, whether it's non-payment of rent or other violations that we're not going to be able to assist with, anything that under the sun that falls under a scope of violating an agreement. So we should be having that out in the next couple of days to try and get a feel for actually what it is that we're going to be able to help with. We are in the process of trying to locate some homeless prevention funding. Our agency is currently out of all homeless prevention funding to start trying to chip away at this tidal wave we know is coming. So other than that, we've applied for everything possible that's out there to try and get some additional funds coming in, but though it's a slow process of how that moves forward, we may not see that money until the tidal wave is released.
I think that thanks for sharing that information. I think your decision to reach out to landlords to find out what they need, I think that's a really great idea. Hopefully you can sort of leverage that information to engage local private funders and obviously for funding applications, et cetera. I'm wondering once you have that letter or whatever it's going to look like ready to go out to landlords to request this information, if that's something that you would be willing to post on the COVID-19 workplace page or send to our office and we can post it for you or something like that so others can maybe reuse your form or use with modifications and sort of think through proactively collecting this information as well.
So it's actually a SurveyMonkey that is going in under the county social service account. So I'll have somebody reach out to them and see if we could get a copy of it or maybe send you guys a link to it.
Sure, that'd be great. I know in the survey software that we use, you can download the survey. I don't know if that's an option through SurveyMonkey, but either way, if you can share it, that's great. If not, we can certainly talk more about that idea if folks have specific questions. Anybody else want to sort of talk through what's happening in their county? So you'll have obviously an opportunity to sort of join in at the end as well if you want to share some ideas then.
Lee, there's a
question here.
Oh,
yep. If the landlords receive ESG funding, wouldn't that federal funding mean they cannot begin eviction proceedings until July? So I don't believe so. That's a great question. I think when they say federally supported housing, however, they're talking about other forms of housing assistance. Lauren or Sierra, is that something that you know, or Brendan and Angela, I know you're both on the line as well. I don't know if that's something you can respond to. We can definitely circle back to that question. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'll look through notes. Off the top of my head, I am thinking it's more so related to like a permanent subsidized housing situation. I guess with this instance, I'd want to know, for example, if someone's receiving ESG rapid rehousing and they've experienced a decrease in income, we would recalculate the portion of rent that they're responsible, et cetera. So I would think, so one, I'll follow up. And the second, I guess it would be the reason for the eviction. So it could be different with if it's non-payment of rent versus like a lease violation.
Right. And I think what Lauren just said, I want to piggyback on that for a minute because I can't remember if it's in one of the next slides or not. But I think one of the things that HUD and others have been really reminding folks is that for example, for rapid rehousing assistance, whether it's ESG or COC funded or some other funding source, the conditions of the funding can change based on changes that are happening with the household, right? That the assistance is supposed to be person-centered, not program-centered. And so if the original intention and plan was for the household to receive, let's say, 6 months of assistance, and on month 2 or 3, they'd gained employment and the portion of rent that they were paying had increased, and then fast forward to March or April, they lose their employment. You can certainly, and frankly should, increase the amount of rental assistance being provided so that they are not being evicted, and B, extend the timing of the rental assistance beyond 6 months if that's what's required to ensure that household can reconnect to employment and is not returning to homelessness. So I would definitely encourage folks to really think through their ESG, their COC, whatever funding sources they're using for rapid rehousing to to modify their original intentions or plan for a particular household to accommodate what's happening now. I think you may also have, for example, open cases with households where they're not receiving additional rapid rehousing assistance, but they're just having some additional case management that's occurring. In those cases, those households may need to restart financial assistance as well, whether it's through utilities or rental assistance. And I just want to remind you, if you have COC funding, that you can use some of that funding to pay for arrears. So again, if you have a household that a month ago you did not pay for their rental assistance because they're fully covering it, but you're still providing case management and services, you can certainly go back and help them with arrears. And there's a process. We've talked about that on previous calls. If there's questions, you can certainly let us know that. But that is something that you should certainly be considering, is the process for adjusting your program to accommodate the needs of the households that you're already serving. On my end, there's something going. I don't know what's happening. I don't know if it's on everybody's computer or if it's just mine. I don't have a great internet connection, so maybe it's just mine. Or do other folks see something on the computer screen right now?
I don't see anything other than your screen.
Okay. It looks fine from my perspective, and I heard that. Okay, so I'm going to just assume it's me. All right. Technology is my very best friend. Okay, so I have the PowerPoint up on my end too, so I'm just going to keep going forward and say next slide. And I can't see the slides anymore, Brendan, but I believe that it would say building a framework at the top in bold. This is directly from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. I certainly want to give them credit because I literally copied and pasted it from one of their blog posts because I thought it was important. So building a framework, this is the first step in the process, is to determine your priorities during the pandemic. The Alliance's framework involves 5 key areas that every community should be centering their efforts around. I just wanted to take a moment to review those. And I've also at the bottom provided the link to access this blog post. Preventing and diverting people from imminent homelessness. You know, that's one of the things that we've been talking about this entire office hours thus far, and certainly is important. Promoting the health and safety of people who are unsheltered while quickly transitioning them to temporary or permanent housing. That's, you know, a second sort of that's where we really started these office hours, and many of the conversations I know that I've been involved in, and many of our staff have been involved in with you all in the last couple months, is really looking at who needs shelter and how we're going to get them to the right place as quickly as possible. Next, expanding and improving shelter options to come into compliance with CDC guidance for separation, isolation, and quarantine. So one of the things that we've been talking about as well is making sure that you have who are both in shelter and sheltering in hotels or motels, and you've got folks that are at higher risk or more vulnerable to COVID-19, really thinking through how you're prioritizing bed use versus shelter bed use versus sheltering in hotels and motels, meaning that you would look to put folks in hotel rooms separate who are more vulnerable and perhaps have a younger or less vulnerable individuals in shelter, still using social distancing and things like that. Stabilizing households in homeless system funded programs like rapid rehousing and permanent supportive housing. That really speaks to what we just discussed. in terms of ensuring that the households that you're already serving are supported to continue maintaining their housing. We certainly don't want folks to be exiting our programs only to then return to the homeless system, when instead we could amend the level of assistance or the length of assistance that they're receiving. And then lastly listed there, rapidly exiting people from the homeless system into housing. Obviously, I think this is important for so many reasons. One is that the best way to be safe, obviously, is going to be in your own house as opposed to any sort of congregate setting. But secondly, some of the health experts and things that folks are sort of predicting will happen are really sort of two things that begin to reopen. Some communities may experience surges and infection, and positive cases that they did not experience the first go round, and have been sort of protected from through the social distancing and the shutdown. And once communities are open, we may see surges in new communities. And then secondly, this sort of expecting or potential for another sort of wave of the virus to take off later this year. So those two reasons alone, forget any number of other reasons we could list, I think reinforce the importance of really making sure that folks who are currently experiencing homelessness in the system are exited to permanent housing as quickly as possible. If your community has full shelters right now and is about to reopen, and a month from now really sees an explosion of COVID-19 cases, and you still have a shelter full of folks, with new folks coming in requesting emergency shelter, there's going to be a real issue sort of round two that occurs. And so really looking at the importance of getting folks into permanent housing as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. So we're almost through. So if you haven't asked questions yet or haven't shared something that you want to share, just know that we really only have 2 slides left. And I'm going to move somewhat quickly through these. So planning, that's what I indicated at the very beginning we really wanted to sort of focus on today. And these are just some priorities to consider. As you consider applying for ESG funding or other resources available through the CARES Act, things to consider include, are there individuals or households in your community who are still experiencing unsheltered homelessness? I know in many communities you've reported that you haven't seen a surge in homelessness because of COVID-19, and some you've said we've experienced a surge, but we've been able to safely house folks through our shelter and hotels and motels. And in some communities you've said that you still have folks who are unsheltered. So I think really understanding how and why that's happening. Is it because of the lack of resources? Is it because you don't have low barrier shelters in your community, and there needs to be some discussion with those shelters about the importance of lowering those barriers, especially at this time, to allow more folks to come into shelter? Is it that the people who are unsheltered recognize the risks that that also exist in shelter, and therefore have a lack of desire to come into a congregate setting where their level of exposure could be higher indoors versus sleeping outdoors, etc. But one of the things to sort of really make sure that you're planning around is if there are folks who are unsheltered who would come in, if resources were made available, that you're really planning still on how to address those resources, access resources to accommodate that. Are the shelters in your community full? This is something I just spoke to. Do you have the necessary resources? Again, if not, really looking at what resources are coming out. I don't mean to keep saying ESG, 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 but that is where the majority of the homeless assistance resources have been funneled. As we've indicated, and previous calls, $4 billion within the CARES Act was allocated specifically through the ESG funding source. Finally, as counties reopen and the eviction moratorium expires, how can your community prevent significant increases in the number of people in need of shelter and or rapid rehousing assistance? Really, that was what the beginning of this webinar was really talking about, is what can we do now to try to engage landlords and try to engage the judicial system, trying to engage utility companies, whoever we can, to minimize the number of people who are going to be all knocking on the door at the same time. But I think beyond that, one of the most important things to be discussed at the community level is considering that we're going to be getting a lot more demand for prevention assistance and eviction prevention assistance, etc. How are we going to make sure that we are prioritizing or targeting the assistance that we have to those people who are most likely to enter the homeless system? I think this is one of the most important questions that really needs to be asked and considered. Some folks had employment. They were not. They were good tenants. They're behind a couple months. They're going to be returning to work. Those are not necessarily the people. Are they in need? Absolutely. Do they deserve your assistance from you to get caught up? 100%. But at the same time, those are not the same households that are going to most likely end up at your shelter door if they do not get prevention financial assistance. They may be better assisted through legal assistance, legal services, or some other type of assistance and guidance through your case managers in order to negotiate a repayment plan with their landlord, etc. But the real folks that I would really like to encourage everybody to think through how you're going to effectively target and prioritize for these dollars are the folks that without your assistance are really going to end up needing access to shelter. Really having a conversation about all the resources in your community that are available. If you have HAP dollars that you haven't fully expended and you don't have money in one bucket, requesting a waiver to move money from one bucket to another. If you already have ESG funding, looking at that as an option. If you have folks who are in COC or ESG funded programs, amending sort of their the expectations or the level of financial assistance that you're providing currently to keep them in housing, and really thinking through what resources or what relationships are you leveraging? Are there ways that the housing authority can be helpful, that you're a community foundation, that a healthcare organization, or the judicial system, whoever it is, how can you as a community really work on leveraging those resources, applying pressure if and when needed and if possible to prevent evictions due to non-payment, etc. Next slide, please. The other thing I just want to make folks aware of, because this information is going to be coming out as soon as possible this week, the Eastern and Western PACOC governing boards met last week to discuss resources that have been made available through PHFA, the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Agency, as well as the 2020 Home for Good, which is funded jointly by the Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh and PHFA, to talk about allocating those funds as sort of a stopgap measure between now and when the ESG funds are put on the street by DCED. What both governing boards are looking at doing is creating an allocation to each county. And so the next step that you will probably see later this week is an email that comes from either Lauren or Sierra on this call, or from the COC email address, Eastern PACOC or Western PACOC, that asks if you can collaboratively work with the other organizations in your community to identify a local lead agency, and it'll indicate what the local lead agency will be responsible for. There's a call in the West on Thursday, so your note might not come out till the very beginning of next week. But in the East, I think we may get that out this week, I'm hoping. But basically, it's based on the community, the organizations in your community, who is it going to make the most sense to sort of be the one to hold this grant from the COC and then report back the measures. So there's going to be a very simple sort of contract in place to say that this money is going to be made available to your county. You're going to use it collaboratively for these purposes. The purposes really are sheltering, if you still have people who need shelter in your community, and prevention assistance until the DCED money runs out. I know that a lot of folks are saying, we don't have a lot of positive cases in our community. I understand that's the case. You have nothing to worry about, because you do have a lot of people, I am certain, who are facing unemployment right now and may need prevention assistance. And so this is not tied to a positive COVID diagnosis or anything like that. But nonetheless, this is money that the COCs we're going to be working to get this money on the street as quickly as possible. So hopefully within the next 2 to 3 weeks, I would expect that the money will be on the street. But I'm not in charge of that piece, so I can't make promises in that way. But we're obviously doing everything we can in our office to make sure that the organizations have the information they need to get the money out. There's a formula that's being used to determine how much money will be going to each county in a fair, equitable, data-driven way. And so more information about that will be available as soon as possible. Next slide, please. So we only have a few minutes left. I have been completely disconnected from the Skype, so I can't tell if anybody has submitted questions or not, but can somebody else indicate if there are questions in the chat?
Lee, this is Lauren. Not since Carissa's, well, so April's going to be sending you the survey that Sergio mentioned. And circling back
Thank you, April.
to Carissa's question, I posted the link to a recent HUD office hour, and minute 48 of that recording at that link, HUD does address the ESG, the eviction moratorium. So folks in COC, ESG, and HOPWA assisted housing are covered by that moratorium through July 24th. It is for non-payment of rent only. So if there are other reasons why why a landlord is evicting a tenant, they are not covered through July 24th. It solely addresses non-payment of rent.
Thank you. So that was a great question. What else? Anything else folks want to ask? If you're on the computer, you can hit the little microphone button on the computer or *6 on your phone. If there are things that you would like to suggest that we focus on next Monday for the office hours, certainly please unmute yourself and let us know what your thoughts are there. Going back to the question we asked before, if folks have started engaging, folks from the judicial system or landlords or anybody else in their community to start planning for potential eviction surges, I would love to hear more about what you're doing. Brendan, I'm not sure, hate to put you on the spot, I'm sorry. I know that DCD was hosting a coffee and conversation or something like that this morning for ESG. I don't know if there was anything sort of groundbreaking that came out of that conversation or anything that you might want to share with folks that that came out. I don't even know if you were on that, frankly, so I apologize for putting you on the spot.
Yeah, I did participate, and there were some good questions that came out of it. None that I have just in my memory right now that I can just rattle off. That was recorded, though, so as soon as it's available, I can share the recording.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you. And was it about the COVID, the new money coming out, the ESGCV, or existing grants, or both?
It covered both.
Okay, great. Well, if folks don't have any comments or questions at this time, we can wrap up for today. I would just like to say, I think on the next slide, or no, it's on this slide, you know, that survey link remains open. You can continue to submit questions, but if you have things that you would like to see covered next week, that would be great to post, to submit that as well. And we can incorporate it into next week's office hours. So thank you for your participation, and we will talk soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.